Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special episode of Active Inference Insights. I'm your host, Darius Parvizi-Wayne, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking to Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Dr. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, philosopher, and literary scholar, best known for his two books, or rather tomes, The Matter and His Emissary and The Master and His Emissary, and The Matter with Things. In these, he explores the radically different worldviews presented by the two hemispheres of the brain and the many implications, both at the personal and the societal level, of such cerebral lateralisation. Iain McGilchrist, welcome to the show, and again, thank you so very much for joining me.
Thanks, Darius. It's a great pleasure.
So I think, as I said, sort of off stream, plenty of people in the audience will be familiar with your work and I'm sure have read at least one of the two books. But it might be worth just starting with a very general overview of the kind of lateralization hypothesis,
Yes.
Which we can use as a sort of launch pad to get into deeper issues.
Yes, well, most people who don't know an awful lot about it know that this has all been rubbished long ago, and that differences between brain hemispheres is pop psychology and all that. And that's a position that I understand, because after some phenomenal experiments that were made possible by the so-called split brain operation carried out in Caltech in the 60s and 70s to enable people with intractable epilepsy to lead a life by dividing the two hemispheres, it was possible for psychologists to interview and engage with one hemisphere of a person at a time and get quite different results. This led to a lot of speculation, most of which was wrong. But when we start speculating in science, we usually get it wrong. That's not unusual. This is the whole process of science. You refine it, you change it, you replace it. So there are three things that make it a curious issue and one worth addressing. First of all, I suppose, before I even say that, any neurologist knows that it's not just the site, but the side of the lesion that makes the difference. So the site is important, but the side is crucial. But when you think about it in the abstract, the brain, an organ which has power from making connections and whose power exists in connections, is divided. Why? It's also asymmetrical in just about everything that can be measured both functionally and physiologically. Why? And thirdly, there is a band of fibers at the base of the brain called the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. Only about 2% of neurons actually cross it, and a lot of its traffic is in the service of inhibition. It's one hemisphere inhibiting the other as much as exciting it. So those questions led me to 30 years, really, of examining this question. And what I think the explanation of this strange phenomenon of the divided brain can be put like this. It answers a simple evolutionary question: how to eat without being eaten. So in order to get stuff, principally to eat, but also perhaps in a bird, a twig to build a nest, in an ape to pick up something to use as a tool, you have to be able to bring a narrow beam, sharply focused attention to bear on a detail. But if that's the only kind of attention you're paying, then you're not aware of the other 357 degrees arc of attention available to you. And in that arena, there may be a predator. There may also be your kin, your mate, and your offspring that you need to look after. So the one hemisphere, and in humans this is, and it becomes so over evolution, the left hemisphere that deals with this very narrowly targeted attention to something it already knows in order to grab it and get it, is conducted out of the left hemisphere. It's the left hemisphere that controls the right hand with which most of us do the grabbing and getting. And the right hemisphere has been left with the task of understanding the whole of the rest of the picture. So, I mean, as a soundbite, I sometimes say the left hemisphere manipulates what's there. It apprehends it in the sense of adprehendery, grasping onto something. But the right hemisphere understands it. It comprehends it. In other words, holds it together. So those are two important distinctions. And I'll just say a little about the consequences of this. when one hemisphere is working alone, and of course in the normal situation that doesn't happen, but what we know from either accidents of nature or from experimentation is that the left hemisphere sees a world corresponding to the kind of attention it pays, because attention brings into being the reality we experience. How we attend matters. And if you pay this piecemeal attention to small bits, what you see is a world made up of small bits, a fragmented world, a world in which things are cut from context, separate from one another, known because they're the things the left hemisphere targets, what it's familiar with, what it wants. They're also static, they're fixed by this Gorgon gaze, the thing I want. And they're abstract, they're categorized, they're decontextualized and effectively inanimate. And I'm not using that expression in a loose way. We know that there are differences between the hemispheres in the way in which they see things, such that the right hemisphere may see things that we normally think of as inanimate as animate, for example, the sun, and the left hemisphere may see things that we normally think of as animate as inanimate, for example, your partner. So this has big consequences. The right hemisphere, meantime, is seeing a world in which, not that it's chaotic, but nothing is ever finally fixed and certain. Nothing is ever fully known. Nothing is ever entirely static. It's always on the move. It's always massively interconnected with lots of other things. Hence, the context, stripped away by the left hemisphere, makes a huge difference to the meaning of what it is we're seeing. It understands what's implicit. The left hemisphere more concentrates on what is explicit. And I would argue that much of what gives value to life is implicit. And this is in effect a world which is living and animate. And there are just two further things to say. One is that the right hemisphere sees a world as it presences, to use a Heideggerian term, but what it means is as whatever it is that we're attending to is coming into being for us. Whereas the left hemisphere sees a representation, which is literally something that is present again after the fact, when of course it is no longer present. So one is effectively the left hemisphere's world, rather like a map, a schema, a theory, a diagram. Whereas the right hemisphere's world is more like the world that is mapped in all its richness and complexity. That was my elevator pitch in whatever it was, 5 minutes.
Excellent. No, that's very good. That's an excellent elevator pitch. There's a, at least within the active inference community, there's a general understanding, or a general claim at least, that neuroanatomy has a rather interesting mapping to the structure of the world. So, for example, the fact that the brain is anatomically hierarchical seems to have some mapping with the temporal, the time scales at which the world unfolds, such that if you have a predictive hierarchy, let's say, your higher order dynamics are going to be tracking the slower fluctuations in the environment, and this all plays neuroanatomically. Is there a way in which, beyond pure asymmetry, and as you say, the brain is neuroanatomically asymmetrical, not only in its division into the two hemispheres, but also the actual structure of the hemispheres, and you outline this in The Master and His Emissary. Is there any other way in which the actual neuroanatomical structure of the brain resembles these underlying functions?
By function, do you mean the world?
I mean, insofar as if we have these dichotomized roles for the hemispheres,
Yes.
So implicit versus explicit,
Yes.
the gestalt versus the part,
Yes.
if you will.
Yeah.
Is there anything that a neuroanatomist could look inside the hemispheres and say, okay, there's something genuinely physical that is mapping onto those dichotomies?
Indeed, yes. I mean, I think the structure of the brain does reflect the, if you want to put it this way, the reality with which it's engaged. It's hardly surprising, because it will have evolved to understand whatever it is that it's there to engage with. And of course, the question arises, is the structure of the brain a function of the structure of the world that it's engaging with, or is the way we see the world a function of the structure of the brain? And I made that point in the presence of Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and he replied with a very McGilchristian point that I should have forestalled. Does it have to be either? And I think that's probably right. They are interdependent and they reflect one another. And the thing that really is, I think, not only just intellectually interesting, but of great philosophical significance, is something that I spend the first 400 pages of The Matter with Things explaining, which is that when it comes to what I call the portals through which we can gain information about the world, and I take these to be, and other people might take them to be something else, but I think it covers the ground. I take them to be attention in the first case, perception, which of course is not the same as attention, but partly depends on attention, judgments that we form on the basis of what we attend to and what we perceive, emotional and social intelligence and understanding, cognitive intelligence, IQ, basically, and a degree of creativity whereby we adapt what we're seeing according to possibilities. In each of these cases, the right hemisphere is superior to the left. And the odd thing is, well, people will say, well, that can't be right, because why would the right hemisphere be always superior to the left? What's the point in having it? And the answer is the left hemisphere is vastly superior to the right in one thing, which I call apprehension, which is being able to grasp things and calculate with them and move them about and use them effectively. So it has one value, which is utility, and the right hemisphere has other values, such as goodness, beauty, and truth. So there is a hierarchy, both in how good they are at understanding and in what they're able to understand. And that hierarchy suggests that the right hemisphere should be, if you like, in overall control, not close control, but overall command of what the right hemisphere is telling it. And it's interesting that from an electrophysiological point of view, the left hemisphere communicates with the right hemisphere less frequently and less to a lesser extent than the right does with the left. There are a number of asymmetries built into the structure and function of the brain, and they point to differences that I think are essential in the world, especially for people like philosophers who are trying to grapple with questions like what can we believe to be the case?
Excellent. Yeah, so the notion of asymmetry here is really interesting, especially kind of functional asymmetry, which is, I guess, encoded in the very title, The Master and His Emissary, this kind of Nietzschean fable that the right is the master and the left is the emissary. It maps, at least in my mind, to a kind of classic, you mentioned utility there, a classic distinction within psychology and now theoretical neurobiology about exploitation versus exploration. And these trade-offs, as I'm sure you know, that are fundamental to our sense-making and our self-organization. And I've been thinking about this, especially in terms of attention, because attention seems simultaneously to be a kind of utilitarian process, such that we zero in on things that we want, but also it's exploratory, and this comes back to kind of the very notion of salience, this distinction between it's information gain fundamentally. And I've been thinking, is there an asymmetry there in value? And I kind of think there is, because I think there's an interesting point that information gain is only useful if it's in the game of providing useful information gain to the organism that then will enact exploitative behavior. So I've been writing this paper, it's just been accepted, doesn't really matter, but I have this example of a bird versus a kind of floating leaf in the periphery of my visual field. And actually, it isn't really worth me paying deep attention to it, because to uncover the hidden cause of that is a waste of time, and it doesn't yield the same pragmatic effects as it might the epistemic value. However, if that object seems to start to engross my attentional field, I will automatically turn to it and try and uncover its hidden cause, which implies to me that epistemic information gain is somewhat enslaved by the utility of getting out of the way of whatever's coming my way. All of this to say that, is there a potential here? Is there a potential counter argument that the left hemisphere might itself be the master? Because everything everything can be summed in some utilitarian sense, or in the sense of utility, in terms of pure self-organization and in terms of predictive processing and active inference, providing model evidence for our preferences, or just bringing the world that we desire into being. And actually, all the beauty, truth, goodness, morality, and so on are in fact enslaved by that overall goal.
Well, naturally, you would expect that I don't agree with that at all.
It's simply the devil's advocate, playing Ramachandran's devil's advocate.
Yes, no, that's fine, of course. We don't live to eat, but eat to live. So the business of getting stuff to help us thrive is an important part of our life, but it's by no means all of our life or the life of any animal. So, I mean, there is a question for the utilitarian, which was first pointed out by Lessing in the 18th century. He has to answer the question, utility for what? And if the answer is just for further use, it hasn't really got us any further forward. So utility is a service in permitting something else to be going on. So, I mean, I would say, put it from a philosophical point of view the other way around. But I'd also say that the one that explores, which is the right hemisphere, and is therefore able to look around the environment and see what is there, you could say that's in utility, because, I mean, you can reduce everything to a utility if you wish. It's just a point of view. But it's not the only point of view. In that point of view, it is the right hemisphere that is being just as useful as the left hemisphere, which is exploiting what it knows. And indeed, the left hemisphere won't get very far without having the exploratory attention of the right hemisphere. On its own, it will not survive. And it is interesting that these two types of attention, and I'm sure you were putting it forward in realization of that the right hemisphere is the hemisphere of exploration, and the left of going a little bit beyond what it is we know. Whereas the left hemisphere is enslaved, to use your term, to what it is it does know, and therefore is not good at changing set, being flexible, suddenly realizing I need to look at this differently. There's a big literature on that, on the relative inflexibility of the left hemisphere. And when you put that together with its knowing less, understanding less, I think you've got a hard case to make, and I know you're not wedded to making it, that the left hemisphere should be viewed as the master there. One little clinical observation is that when you have frontal damage and the posterior cortex is released from frontal control, in the case of the left hemisphere, the hand starts grabbing and grasping things, even imaginary things, but it starts to it will go to a picture and try and take something out of it. It tries to lock onto, if it's passing a chest of drawers, it will try to catch onto the knob. Whereas in the case of the right hemisphere, when it's disinhibited from frontal control, the hand starts to explore. It explores the environment with sort of movements of a tentative kind going out. So it is. I mean, there's no question that those are important differences between the two hemispheres.
Quite. I mean, so this is I've been really interested in not only exploratory versus exploitative behavior with respect to attention, but also so-called endogenous versus exogenous attention, which is a dichotomy or distinction, as you know, that goes all the way back to the 80s and Posner and people like this. And to cut a long story short, the brunt of my paper is that I think this dichotomy is massively oversimplified and needs dismantling somewhat, although the distinctions are useful. But in terms of going back to the neuroanatomy, there's a really interesting finding. So this is mainly Corbetta and Schulman and their big 2002 Nature review paper. And they find that endogenous attention, which is generally taken to be goal-driven and voluntary, is localized to the intraparietal cortex and the superior frontal cortex, not necessarily with hemispheric specialization. But exogenous attention, which is localized to the temporal parietal cortex and the inferior frontal cortex, is mainly lateralized to the right hemisphere. And I think this maps exactly what we were
Yes.
saying, which is that the exogenous attention is constantly being drawn by interesting and relevant stimuli. One thing I wanted to ask you about is one of the classic criteria of exogenous attention is it's involuntary. And I think we sense that, right? If we hear an ambulance
Mm,
siren, we're immediately drawn to it.
mm,
And this, in principle, is an instance of exogenous attention.
mm.
But that doesn't really seem to be in keeping with the right hemisphere's relationality. It's, I don't know,
No,
involuntary doesn't really seem to be a particularly right
no.
hemispheric capacity. So how do you sort of marry that and make that compatible?
Well, of course, the first thing to say is that involuntary motivations are present throughout the brain and in both hemispheres, quite obviously. But I don't think the right
Mm.
hemisphere's attention is simply passively drawn, if that's what involuntary means, towards a stimulus. I mean, of course, if there is a threatening or exciting stimulus, then the brain in general is going to be drawn towards it. But the thing about right hemisphere attention is that it can also calibrate more easily than the left hemisphere whether this attention is as it were, worthwhile, is worth the effort of attending to or not. So it can inhibit. One of the things that is important about the right hemisphere is its capability of inhibiting its own processes, which is a greater capacity than obviously the left hemisphere can do that too. But in general, the left hemisphere tends to be more, again, to use your useful term, enslaved to a response to something, which is its automatic response to it. And it seems to jump to conclusions. So sometimes people say to me, so I guess that, oh God, what's his name? The Nobel Prize winning System 1, System 2. I've just forgotten his name.
Kahneman.
Sorry?
Daniel
Yes,
Kahneman.
Kahneman. Of course, yeah, I
Kahneman.
mean, I know
University.
Kahneman well, but sorry, his name just disappeared. So Kahneman System 1 and System 2, and we've corresponded about this very briefly, but um, uh, we don't think that. I mean, first of all, he's carving the brain from top to bottom more than from side to side, which I am. But also because the evidence is that the left hemisphere jumps to conclusions. It's quick and dirty. It wants a decision fast, partly because it is the predator in
Mm.
us and can't really afford to miss an opportunity. I mean, it may get it wrong, but it doesn't really matter. But hesitating and you will lose it. So it tends to rush in. Whereas, as Ramachandran says, the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate. It's losing milliseconds by saying, yeah, but hang on, it could be this, it could be that, and is much better at inhibiting what it is it's going to latch onto, as well as inhibiting inappropriate emotional responses, which is interesting because it goes with its being emotionally more sophisticated than the left hemisphere.
Yes, I wanted just to that's all super useful. And actually, speaking of usefulness, back to usefulness, there's a constant tension, I guess, within the brain sciences and the human sciences about the distinction between teleology and teleonomy. And teleology is a kind of Aristotelian notion that there really is a final cause and we're moving towards something in a purposive manner. And then teleonomy is the apparent purposiveness of our behavior. And I thought you said something really interesting there, which goes back to Lessing, which is that it's always utility for something. And the way that I posed that initial question was the utility is defined by these kinds of preferences, which in a predictive processing hierarchy is encoded right up and down a generative model. And in principle, everything unfolds through the lens of those predictions. But I sense a kind of skepticism on your part of that, because I mean, on one part, that seems an incredibly self-contained and self-referential system, and doesn't really allow, in any profound sense, for relationality. And maybe perhaps the generative model or these preferences should span the agent environment arena. But more broadly, do you believe in a fundamental telos for which our attention is being guided, or these hemispheres are acting in correspondence? beyond, let's say, mere survival or mere self-organization?
Well, it's a very good and rather rich and complex question, I think. I think it depends very much what you mean by a telos. In essence, as you pointed out, the necessity to survive must be a goal for whatever a creature is doing. That's bound to be part of it. But then you ask about whether there is other values, perhaps beyond, and I think that there are. I think that we've bought into a very hydraulic system in which what we do is push from behind. So rather like a mechanism, we're sort of responding to something that pushes us, and we either push back or we go on or whatever. But we're not drawn from in front. And I think that when you think about the way human lives evolve and why we do any of the things we do, we cannot ignore the fact that we are drawn to certain ends, certain, not that we have a necessary plan of how we're going to do it, but those are ends that we feel an allure to, that we esteem, we value, we wish to respond adequately to. And I think there the right hemisphere has a broader canvas than the left in what it's doing. And I'm not sure that really the distinction, which I'm familiar with, between teleology and teleonomics is really getting us very far. I feel it's a kind of a verbal sleight of hand whereby one can reintroduce teleology, which has been a big no-no for such a long time, without appearing to do so. And, but at last we're able to say not that turtles go ashore and lay their eggs, but we can now say turtles go ashore to lay their eggs. They do. And it seems particularly perverse and artificial to deny that any creature has any kind of a goal. Even if you look at an amoeba under a microscope in a drop of pond water, you can see it exploring certain things and gravitating towards certain things. So I think that there is direction, and that direction is partly governed by our values, and not the only value is utility, I claim. But there isn't a kind of what people fear, I think completely rightly, is the idea of it's all been worked out in advance and this is a purpose that the universe is taking us to. That implies some sort of overall very large divine kind of mechanism, a sort of, a celestial engineer who's worked out the plan. And I don't believe that. So I think that nonetheless, there is shape and meaning to the direction that evolution has taken. I think it's extraordinary that it has managed to invent the eye 14 times, according to Robin Conway Morris, because it's a rather amazing thing to have invented even once.
Yes, well, there's all this wonderful work by Michael Levin. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with
Very
Mike's
much.
work about sort of morphogenesis and
Absolutely.
the capacity for these organisms to sort of grow frog's legs or an eye on the frog's leg, and all this like this apparently invisible morphogenetic space in which things seem to tend. And again, I think, well, there's an ongoing debate. I mean, this podcast is called Active Inference Insights, and oftentimes I will diverge from active inference because my fundamental
Yeah.
orientation is philosophy, and active inference is fundamentally a theory of physics. But I'm not sure, and we can, I could try and unpick this, but there's an ongoing debate in active inference and the free energy principle, which is Carl's
Yeah.
great, architectural achievement, which is whether things purely look as if they are maximizing model evidence, as if they're doing some Bayesian work, they're minimizing variational free energy. So that's a looks like, that's a descriptive instrumental tool for you and I as scientists, or whether there is, things actually have the architectural systems that might solely be descriptive. So there's the Markov blanket, for example, or they are actually doing some form of variational Bayesian inference. And I guess this comes very much to our question of telos and teleology. I mean, is there a risk that when I say, well, actually all I can ever really say is that this is an exceptionally good modeling tool, and I can use it to sort of get very close to the phenomena but never really speak of the phenomena? How much of a limitation do you actually see of that? And also, do you see that applying also to the hemispheric hypothesis?
Yes, I think one has to distinguish between the value of truth and whether a certain thing is true to what it is modeling, and
Mm.
whether or not it is simply another way of describing it. So I would say that hemisphere theory is not just another way of describing, it adds something. But I think it's generally true that
Hmm.
when we model in science, as Niels Bohr said, we are not necessarily talking about the reality of what is there. What we're talking about is making our observations cohere with what we making them into a coherent picture of what it is we're observing. So, in other words, it's not really about finally uncovering the reality. It's about a way of modeling, which may be good or bad. And I think that would be the way I generally look at it. Um, I
Do you find Do you find that if the fundamental motive is to have an internally coherent system, one runs the risk of pure self enclosure and self referentiality, um, absent any ontological grounding? I mean, if my theory is simply that things look as if they're doing basic variational Bayesian inference, and I can say everything from the cosmos to an atom is looking like it's doing so, well, I've got some fundamental axiom that there are things in the universe like an atom and the cosmos. But beyond that, it seems like I'm just constructing my theory and then building it out from the inside without ever really getting out of the cave. Um, where is the kind of tether in your mind to reality?
mm,
I mean, to put my cards on the table, I think it may be phenomena.
mm,
I think it
mm,
may be consciousness,
absolutely,
because that seems to me to be the kind of ontological prior. Everything itself is realized and understood through
yes,
consciousness. And there's obviously a massive problem here about how we can get from mathematics to consciousness and going from the math
yes,
to the territory, or the map to the territory.
yes.
But I'm curious about how you see that mapping. And again, is it consciousness? Is it mathematics? What is the fundamental tether?
I don't think it's mathematics. I mean, mathematics is of course um, enormously useful and beautiful, but it's by nature not intended to cover the whole of reality. I mean, this was a mistake that Galileo made when he said that the cosmos, the book of the cosmos, is written in numbers. Well, yes, it is, some of it, but also some of it's
Mm.
written in things that, frankly, are non-numerical. And you won't understand them better by doing more maths about them. I mean, there are people with, particularly people with schizophrenia, but sometimes people with right hemisphere damage, who want to work out in mathematical terms what it is that somebody's doing when they are falling in love or making love or whatever. And they have the ambition to be able to reduce it all to an abstract system of mathematics. I would say that's misguided, because our first understanding is not that it's mathematics. Mathematics is something we can bring to it. But like you, I completely would endorse this idea that it's phenomenology. We take in the world in a host of different ways. And some of the ways we aim to understand it are through, and this is the second part of my three-part book, The Matter with Things, epistemology. How do we get closer to truth? And I think one undeniably is
Mm.
through science, another is through the use of reason. But on their own, they can't deal with everything. And in fact, intuition is a very important part of reasoning well. I always say that people who have good intuitions reason better than those who don't. And people who reason well have better intuitions than people who don't. So they're like a pair of twins that should always work together. And in a way, they're in the service of imagination. And this is not in any way to sort of turn one's back on the procedural nature of much of science. But when you come to look at the way in which great steps forward have been taken in our understanding in science and in mathematics, they've often come from an insight, which is a gestalt shift, and from an imaginative leap. Which is not to say that there isn't important stuff to be done at the micro level, doing it in a left hemisphere linear procedural fashion.
Yeah, so there's plenty there. I mean, one is it's kind of ironic that physicists and mathematicians think that, well, either the phenomena is maths or that consciousness could be, the manifestations of consciousness could be mathematically explained, given that their predecessors didn't think so, whether that's Bohr or
No,
Bohm or Einstein.
exactly.
That's one rather ironic thing. A lot of this really makes me think of following the master and his emissary, which I finished only about a couple of weeks ago and massively enjoyed. So thank you for all the insights, first and foremost. I've been digging into Dreyfus because I've always had an interest in Dreyfus and have read around Dreyfus and a bit of Dreyfus, but never really committed to Dreyfus. And Dreyfus has this really interesting idea that he, in his negation or his argument against John Searle, that activity, and it comes back to what you were saying, that we always talk about being pushed from behind but not pulled forward, that activity has a world to mind causal pattern, such that I feel myself drawn through what Merleau-Ponty would call motor intentionality into situations. And I want to briefly touch on Dreyfus and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, because I know you're interested and extremely well read and well versed with these people. That Heidegger, as you know, says that the fundamental way of being is not this kind of Cartesian detachment. Rather, it's Dasein, it's being in the world. What does that tell us about phenomenology? What does that tell us about our consciousness? That if indeed its fundamental way of being is relational and in the world and non-rational in the sense of hyper-rationality and unpicking things in the left hemisphere way, does that tell us anything profound about our fundamental way of being?
I think it does, yes. And I would add to the list of philosophers you mentioned Michael Polanyi, and also Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein made this very important observation that when you stop moving and stop acting and just stare, the world seems to become very strange and no longer has any kind of meaning.
Yeah.
But that when you act in it, it does again. And this is an important observation and goes with the ideas of people like Merleau-Ponty that our being is embedded in the world. This comes back to my emphasis on the importance of both embodiment and context. After all, the context in which we largely act is that of our body and our body's engagement with the world. And it's through that that we come to understand things, not by an Olympian detachment, pretending to be a brain in a vat and just speculating about things in the abstract. So to understand the world, one must be engaged in it. And I think that recognition is important. One of the problems, I'm sorry, I'm a psychiatrist, so I come back, I find the whole business of schizophrenia utterly fascinating. If it weren't such
As do I.
I mean,
So.
if it weren't such a widespread condition, people would be just completely amazed every time they met somebody with schizophrenia, because they see the world in a totally different way. And it's not an exact match, but the simplest way of putting it is they have a hypofunctional right hemisphere in which the left hemisphere is in overdrive. And so there's a kind of hyper-rationalism going on, which is actually not going to lead you to truth or sanity. As G.K. Chesterton wonderfully said, a madman is not somebody who's lost his reason. He's lost everything but his reason, and therefore has to reason on the basis of something that he doesn't understand. So the schizophrenic sitting there and going, somebody's talking to me in this room, and there's nobody in this room. So where's it coming from? He looks around and sees that plug socket over there must be coming out of the plug socket, and that's wired into my neighbor's house. And so the whole thing is built entirely rationally, but on grounds that are not based in experience. So we have to be careful about hyper abstract and hyper rationalistic formulations, not that they can't cast light, but that we should be aware that we're not actually substituting, or shouldn't be substituting, those for the whole of experienced reality. The thing about the color blue,
Yes,
and
yeah,
Patricia Churchland sort of saying, but the color blue just is a wavelength of whatever it is, 104 nanometers per second. So, but actually it isn't. that's a kind of
yeah,
almost irrelevant description of it from outside. But blue is nothing if it is not
mm,
experiential, and that, of course, is not something that can be done through the abstract and numerical approach.
quite. I mean, I feel sometimes quite disheartened reading these well, they call themselves neurophilosophers, but it's like they never read any David Chalmers or Thomas Nagel. But not they know far more than I do. There's so much here, and I'm also very, very interested in self-consciousness,
Mm, mm,
and self-awareness, and what that means,
mm.
because it's an extremely misleading term.
Yes,
But
yes.
it brings me back to Heidegger, because, as you know, and as you've written about, Heidegger is constantly tussling with this subject-object distinction. So, in one of his lectures, he says that the whole aim of his work is to uproot the Cartesian model that has pushed held back philosophy for
Mm,
400 years.
mm.
Nevertheless, it seems to me, at least, that Dasein does still have this structure. It does still have this, in some ways, a relationality. It's not a dissolving of things into a
Absolutely
oneness
not.
like the Buddhists might speak about. There is still there is still, at some level, the acting and the acted, and yet it's not in this sort of Cartesian
No.
manner. When you think about self and other,
Mm,
and I'm very, very keen to come to schizophrenia, because I think this is really
yeah.
a paradigmatic case where it all becomes very interesting. But just at the sort of very neurotypical level of being in the world, what do you sense is going on there? I mean, I presume it's not some Cartesian ego homunculus floating,
No,
behind the eyes.
no.
But how much can we really disband that dichotomy, and how important is it to still keep
Yes.
something like a subject-object distinction?
Yes. Well, the first thing to say, can I start from the end of that question and go back to the first part of it?
Please, but however you
Yeah.
want.
If I can remember. So I think that the ability to hold distinction without division is critical to understanding, and it's something
Yeah,
we seem to have lost. So if you make a distinction, people run very quickly to there being a complete divide. Whereas it isn't. It's rather like the
yeah,
two poles of a magnet. They are very distinct. Neither can live without the other, but they are not divided. In fact, they are completely joined. And if you try to cut one off from the other, you just create another magnet, which is like a hologram of the first. So this idea turns out, I think, to be really, it recurs throughout all my philosophical explorations, the need for union and division, to be unified, not to be divided. So Goethe said, the whole
mm,
business of nature is dividing the united, uniting the divided, and the systole and the diastole, and so on. It's a
mm,
marvelous piece. But effectively, he kept coming back to this, that we should see something that it seems one to be manifold, but see the manifold as being unified at some level. And in the matter of
yeah,
things, I have a whole chapter on this idea, which is so important in Eastern thinking, of the relationship between the one and the many. So I don't want to say that before saying anything about division and union in the case of self and other. And I think it's in The Master and His Emissary, I give the example, of the infant that is completely fused with the mother shortly after birth, and there is a sort of total
mm,
intersubjectivity, and that the business of the gradual separation from the mother over the first year is negotiating a distinction which is not a severance. So it's actually it's not a diminishment of something, it's an increase in it. In much the same way, I sometimes use the image of two heavenly bodies that are rotating around, circulating, orbiting around one another, and it's for them to have that orbiting relationship, they mustn't crash into one another, but they mustn't just fly apart. And indeed, you can say that about a human relationship, that it can become over enmeshed so that the self of each party is not preserved, or it can become so divided that the two have to part. So the whole thing is about holding this tension between two things without collapsing it into one or the other, into mind or body, into self or other, but holding the tension. And that negotiation, which, as I say, is what happens in a properly functional relationship through the intercourse between the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the mother and the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the infant, brings about this ability to be sort of together but not fused. And I think the distinction between the objective and the subjective is a very important one. But the idea that the objective, as naively supposed, that it cuts off every kind of human contribution to the understanding, has got to be wrong, because we can't understand things by not being a human, as it were. We'll understand them less well from a very peculiar point of view in which everything about us has been cut off. That won't lead to a real or true version of what it is. But what I think that objectivity means is the ability to inhabit other perspectives than your own. So objectivity is really seeing things from as many perspectives as you can. And that's very valuable, but it doesn't negate the fact that you have your own point of view, your subjective position.
Yeah, well, I think the work of more modern phenomenologists like a Dan Sahavi, for example, or a Sean Gallagher would suggest that the very act of empathy, in this very broad sense of being able to take the perspective of another, is downstream on the fundamental forminess, what people call pre-reflective self-consciousness, such that, my experience is for me, and I have a privileged access to my own experience, and in doing so, I recognize that you do as well, and there is this mutual modeling and shaping, and yet, and yet. And so intersubjectivity is a component of this kind of subjectivity, and yet there still seems to me at the fundament division is the wrong word, and I don't want to say division, but a fundamental fact that consciousness experience is always for me and not for you. And this goes back to all the way back to sort of Louis Sass and Parnas and the work they did with Dan Sahavi on the fact that in schizophrenia, even that for me-ness is still not lost. So thought insertion is a really useful example here. Metzinger talks about the fact that there's no sense of agency over that thought, or there's no, and others have talked about there being no possession over that thought. But that thought is still for the subject, whatever the form that subject takes. So, given that, is there a way in which, by the very nature as conscious beings who have a privileged access only to our own lens, to our own perspective, we are cast off from others in the deepest manner possible?
I don't think that, no. So consciousness is, for me, best imaged by water. So this is an image from Schelling, but I think it works for me, that in the water there can be a whirlpool or many whirlpools. And the first thing to notice is the whirlpools are not in the water, they are the water. They're not sort of an extraneous object in the water, they're just the form the water takes at the time. And those whirlpools may be very self-involved, so that the movement always returns within this flow. It's very real, it can be photographed, it can be measured, it can have power to move stones, and it will eventually move on. And then it becomes part of the rest of the stream. Now, I see consciousness the individual consciousness as being somewhat like this, that it is connected, and in an enormous number of experiences, it's hard to dismiss all of them as delusional. People seem to be able to feel their consciousness as part of something greater, or part of, or can communicate with somebody else. So I think that I wouldn't take a hard and fast view on consciousness as it's always just me, because I would want to, problematize the word me. What exactly am I? I am
Yes.
part of, first of all, the society that formed me, the culture that formed me, the culture to which I hope I contribute. I'm also part of nature. Nature is in me. It's not around me like the environment. It's in me, and I'm in it. And I would say, because we don't have to go there at all, but I believe that actually, very importantly, there is a divine or sacred aspect to the cosmos, and that in that we also exist. So I would, take a different view, as it were, from the kind of atomistic view of the I.
Yes, I mean, there's again, it was merely a proposal. I don't quite know where I land on it, because I'm also quite taken by the work in this case of Sartre, and more latterly Kenneth Wilford, on the fact that what we call subjectivity may just be consciousness knowing itself. So Kenneth Wilford's got this really nice paper, I think 2016, in one of Metzinger's journals, about how consciousness is this bizarre phenomenon where there is this phenomenal feeling that it's for a subject, but every time we've tried to find that subject, whether it's neurophysiologically or in the Humean introspection, we can't find
Yes.
it. And so, what does it mean to be for a subject that itself might not be present? And he says that, well, that the subject relatum of consciousness might just be the consciousness episode itself.
Yes.
And I think that's a potentially quite neat solution
Yes.
to this kind of vexing issue. But more broadly about consciousness as the river, and I really I too enjoy this metaphor, because it also brings to mind this relationship between change and oneness, and brings to mind Heraclitus
Exactly.
and his insights. It makes me think firstly about its consciousness's relation to matter,
Mm.
because would you say, well, matter is by nature somewhat atomistic, um, self-distinguishing, and cut off. And it seems to me that the whirlpool has, although it's part of nature, it's part of the water. It also has this kind of self-distinguishing way of being. And so, is there a way in which consciousness interacts with matter, such that in me it's taking this form in some intricate manner that I can't quite understand, because I don't know the relationship between matter and consciousness, and I'm sure no one does. But in some ways, matter is fixing consciousness, at least for a transient period of time, such that it can manifest in a thing like me. Hello, all. Before letting Dr. McGilchrist answer my question, I wanted to very quickly jump on and let everyone know that when I was formulating this question, what I had in mind was actually a talk that Iain had given about 3 years ago on the relationship between matter and consciousness. And the reason why I want to make this very clear is because it might seem that in formulating that question, like it's my idea, it's my theory, and I want to express that it's not. And it's totally my fault for not having referenced the talk and not having made it clear that actually this was Iain's original theory and idea. The reason why I formulated this question is because obviously a lot of people might have not seen the talk, and I wanted to lure and get Iain to talk about this incredibly interesting idea. But I think, unfortunately, the execution, it may have seemed that I was trying to take credit for it, and I'm really, really not. So I wanted to come on before the podcast goes live, because the last thing I want to do is take credit for ideas that aren't mine, plagiarize, especially when it comes to someone like Iain, who has worked so hard for so many years to establish these incredibly rich and insightful and thought-provoking theories. So all of this to say that this notion of matter as the kind of stabilizer, facilitator, of consciousness is not my theory. And so if it came across like that when I was asking this question, I really wanted to just come on the record and say, it's absolutely not. It's Iain's. What I will do is I will link this wonderful talk that he gave. It's about an hour and 50 minutes. It's on YouTube. I will link it in the video description below. But anyway, the reason why, as you'll see, Iain basically recapitulates what I've said is because obviously these are things that he had already spoken about. So yeah, totally my fault, but I wanted to come on here and clear that up because again, I don't want anyone shouting at me, I don't want anyone getting the wrong idea, and I definitely don't want to be taking credit for ideas that aren't mine. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conversation, and I will now leave you with Iain because he is far more interesting and wise than me. Okay. Thank you.
What I think about the problem of matter and consciousness as we think of it is that, frankly, despite enormous efforts over very long periods of time, nobody has been able to give a coherent and convincing explanation of how something like consciousness can simply emerge from matter unless matter somehow already partakes of consciousness or is in consciousness or is an aspect of consciousness. If it has nothing to do with consciousness, then no amount of hand waving and gesturing towards complexity and so on can really make something like consciousness, the inwardness of things, come out of it. And in the comparison between how we know consciousness and how we know matter, consciousness is primary in that we can only know matter via consciousness. I may only know consciousness via matter, the brain, but I don't know that. It's certainly not necessary. But it is necessary that to know matter, by the way, we've never seen matter. Nobody has ever experienced matter. All we have experienced is aspects of our consciousness that have qualities that we call material. And I think that what matter is a phase of consciousness, much in the sense that water goes through phases. It's flowing and transparent and runs across your hand. It's opaque and hard and can crack your head open. It's in this room. There's tons of it, unbelievably, in this room. And if there weren't, I wouldn't live. And I can't see it. So people say, well, it doesn't look like matter. Well, no, it wouldn't do. But it doesn't have to. What matter is doing, I think, is providing two things. One of them is permanence for a while, a degree of resistance, which brings permanence. So it's resisting change, and that brings permanence. And it's also it's containing and providing some sort of bound to what I can do and what I can think. And without any bounds, without any, the thing becomes chaos and without any definition. For creativity to happen, there must be an opposing force that is overcome. And for anything to be capable of lasting, it has to have this degree of resistance to change. And that is what matter is, in my view.
Wonderful. Yes. There's so much here that comes to mind. I mean, very briefly, I guess a materialist neuroscientist here would might be pulling their hair out and going, well, just because you can't know ever, there's just an epistemological limit that means that we can't ever know for sure that the brain creates consciousness. That needs to be held as distinct from an ontological premise that the brain causes consciousness. So it might be that I never know this. I can never prove it because of David Chalmers and Nagel and all of the philosophical arguments that have been leveraged in this direction. But nonetheless, ontologically speaking, it's the best solution we have. That they seem so coupled and the brain is so complicated and it's doing all these wonderful things. Of course, consciousness just springs out because the moment you shut one part of the brain off or you have a stroke or a lesion, some element of consciousness disappears. Do you find any truck in that distinction between the epistemology and the ontology here?
Not really, because parts of you will disappear if I change the settings on my screen. Parts of experience will disappear if you go around injuring the brain. No problem there. But I don't believe. I believe there are only three possibilities. Frankly, that the brain is either an emitter of consciousness, which seems to be the favoured one amongst reductionist materialists, or it is a transmitter of consciousness, or it is a permitter of consciousness. In other words, it somehow shapes and filters consciousness and makes it my consciousness. Now, that's what I believe the brain is. And I know you weren't making an argument there, but you gestured towards complexity. But, as you're perfectly aware, the cerebellum has 80% of the neurons in the brain and is massively more complexly interconnected within itself, with Purkinje cells being one of the most massively ramified and interconnected cell neurons, and yet it doesn't sustain consciousness on its own. So I think it's not like that. I mean, I had a conversation with Mark Solms the other day, and Mark says, there's this
Yes.
place in the tectum, I think, or maybe the tegmentum, but I think it's the tectum of the midbrain, where 2 cubic millimeters of white matter, if you put a needle in and disturb it, then the person's gone. But I don't think he thinks, and he said he didn't, that that little bit of matter creates the consciousness. It can't do.
Well, Mark's been on the podcast before, and I like Mark's work a lot, and I think it's very insightful. I guess he'll call himself a dual aspect monist, and so there's some underlying thing, and consciousness is one aspect of it, and matter is another. It seems to me that you're leaning slightly towards a more panpsychist position, but it's almost a different form of panpsychism from, let's say, a traditional. Well, I guess Bertrand Russell and his monism, it comes to mind here, because Russell and latterly Philip Goff, who's the kind of premier panpsychist at the moment, have this idea that, well, as you say, like, if I take it's very akin to what you're saying about never having seen matter. If I have this cup of water, it's not that the matter is the cup of water, right? Its fundamental nature is consciousness, and matter might just describe what physics does, but not what physics is. Now, is there a difference there between what you're saying, which is a consciousness, matter is a facilitatory thing, or process rather, that allows for creativity and the resistant forces that lead to self-actualization, versus saying, well, no, what matter actually is consciousness? Are those two different things?
Well, I suppose I'm naturally a bit skeptical of grand pronouncements like that matter is consciousness, but I think it's a way in which consciousness can manifest, and perhaps that's not a huge difference. I'm having a conversation with Philip Goff as well, so I'm interested in what he will have to say about my view. But my feeling is that he and I probably come quite close on this. So yeah, it is a kind of panpsychism.
Have you
I
thought
believe.
much
Yes.
about?
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No. I mean, to lay my cards on the table, I'm quite I'm quite party to a panpsychist position, but that might just be because I don't know. I think, yeah, no. Look, I guess I don't know.
No.
One thing I do push back against is the epistemic hubris of thinking that we know.
Quite.
And we certainly don't.
No.
What have you thought much about hydroencephalic children and what that might say for this relationship between matter and consciousness? Because these are children whose such an enormous portion of their brain is absent, and yet they seem to be behaving in a conscious manner. Now, again, a materialist reductionist might say, well, they're not conscious, and they might employ some kind of zombie argument. What do you think are the kind of ramifications of that?
Well, I would again, reject epistemic hubris here and say I'm not sure, but to make it clear for any viewer, what we're talking about is not hydrocephalus, in which there is quite a large part of the cranium filled with cerebrospinal fluid instead of with the brain tissue that would normally be there. But I think you're referring to hydranencephaly, in which children are born with virtually no brain at all. So things stop at the brain stem.
That's right.
And what is quite extraordinary, and I don't know how to explain it, is that in the absence of any kind of visual cortex, they are able to recognize and apparently see and distinguish people and their faces. They like pieces of music and have preferred pieces of music. They have preferred toys. And I think once you've seen one of these children, I mean, of course, you can be Descartes and say, I don't know that what I see out of my window are really people. They might just be machines walking about with hats and coats. I mean, it's always open to you to take that position, but I want to appeal to a degree of intuitive, imaginative common sense about it, that it's very unlikely that is the case. It doesn't feel like that. And I
No, I mean, there are these wonderful photos of them
sorry,
smiling.
no, go on.
There are these photos of them sort of at Disneyland smiling while their siblings are on their lap. And
Yeah.
yes, I think common sense might prevail. But again, humility first and foremost. There's the one thing I wanted to ask about when you're talking about resistance is the importance of negation in your
Oh,
work.
yes,
I believe you quote Spinoza, who says that all determination is negation,
exactly.
and I think you say that there are two things one can do in this world: is either say no or not say no, which I think is fantastic, because the word yes just doesn't even intervene. But what does that, again, going back to sort of consciousness and our way of being, how does that play out in terms of our experience? What is it? Is this a metaphysical fact that, in terms of things self-individuating, there is a, as you say, a fundamental tension that if became lax, we would just dissolve into the soup. And active inference, for reasons we can talk about, agrees with this. Or is this also about our conscious experience, that in some ways that which means that it doesn't dissolve into the soup and just becomes about everything, intends about everything, is the fact that consciousness in some ways is saying no and also permitting things to enter into its field?
Yeah. I suppose what I was getting at was that, first of all, negation is how anything becomes defined as what it is. After all, defining is laying down boundaries. And in a way, something only comes into being through the being bound to it. If it is boundlessly mixed with everything else, there's only one thing it can be, which is God or the eternal being or something. But anything that we know in this world has to be defined. And this process is creative. It's how, when an artist is putting down paint on the canvas, he or she is making a decision to paint this and not something else. And it's a very simple point that, when Michelangelo created his David, he didn't put anything together. He just said no to the stone all over the place until finally he'd got the thing that he wanted. And you could say he was saying yes to the image, I suppose, but I suspect that from what one knows about the act of creation, that the thing actually becomes what it is in the process, and it is an evolving relationship between the artist and the artifact or the work of art. So, and what I was suggesting is that when we see things seeking, I give the image again of water because it's so useful for so many things, but the image of the
Yeah.
river, apparently seeking its way through the landscape. But all that what is happening is that the landscape is either saying no or not no to the water. It can't say yes to the water. It's not in a position to do that. It either
Mm.
fails to stop the water or it stops the water. Those are its choices. But that actually brings into being the river. And I think that this is an image of how almost anything comes into being, that in the first instance, it's through the absence of negation to something, and let's see where this goes and what happens. And once the thing is, I suppose, achieves a certain degree, and there isn't an absolute cutoff point of actualization, then it is more possible for us to respond to it as it is and wish to further actualize it.
Yes, again, it brings to mind Dreyfus, because Dreyfus has this idea that sort of when one is actualizing action, you never have the conditions of satisfaction in your mind. It's just
Yes.
unfolding. And but interestingly, Dreyfus does talk about, and I believe this is based off Merleau-Ponty, that there's a kind of tension in that act, and I think he uses the word tension, and by that he means if one senses that one is moving away from an optimal grip on the situation, one is always drawn back to to an expert way of being. And again, I think this it really does speak to the fact that there is no conscious affirmative yes in that. It is just sculpting away, and again, it comes in some ways back to Aristotle, right? I mean, Aristotle's idea that you can only judge a life once it's been lived.
Yes.
It's a disclosure. It's an unfolding.
Yes.
It's not.
Yes.
It's not purposive in the sense of a kind of
No.
Cartesian removal and this is what I want to do and I'm going to do it now. And no, this is not quite right.
And Nietzsche said, the purpose of a melody is not to reach its final note, but unless it reaches its final note, it's not
Yes, yeah,
succeeded
yeah.
as a melody. So, yeah. I mean, I'd love to go back, if we can, to self-consciousness, because I think it's so important. And it also leads to schizophrenia, in which there's a kind of hyper-consciousness that stymies the person's existence in a way. But I don't know why, but when you were giving those instances, I was thinking of something I describe in The Matter with Things, which is to do with expertise. Again, Dreyfus's topic, that in the early stages of learning expertise, it's useful to have guidelines to follow, rules to observe. But that when you get to the last two of his 5 stages of expertise, having such rules or principles is actually damaging. It limits your ability to develop your skill, and you remain forever mediocre. And one of the things I'm intrigued by is people who have motor skills, such as I out of the blue, the physician who looks after the TT racers on the Isle of Man. You'll know what I'm talking about, but maybe for the international audience, there's this completely crazy and infinitely dangerous sporting activity that takes place once a year on the Isle of Man off the coast of Britain, during which all the island's roads are closed and motorbikes race around a 62-mile course that goes over ordinary public roads, round tight bends, over braes and, down sudden inclines and so forth. And at certain times, their speed can approach 200 miles an hour. So this is both very dangerous, given that this is not a perfectly smooth track, and remarkable. But the thing that comes out of it is that they enter a sort of mental state in which they have a kind of total awareness. But if anything distracts their attention to a detail, then they lose the grip. And a lot of it is to do with not trying. So, and this is a familiar story, isn't it? That one rider felt he was doing very well, and then he realized that something was happening to his bike and he had to stop and fix it. And he stopped and fixed it. And after that, he just poodled on because he thought there's no point in going fast now because I know I've lost the thing. But actually, he turned out to have the winning speed. So
well, there's a paradox in there. I think this is Slingerland's trying not to try, and I'm not quite sure how to resolve that paradox.
Yes.
But it's fascinating on this. I hate to do self-aggrandizement and self-advertisement, but actually, very fitting we're talking about flow states because I just myself and several others, including Carl Friston, just published this paper on flow states under an active inference framework and self-awareness in flow states, which was just published a couple of days ago in Frontiers. So you may find that to be
I'll look that up.
But it perhaps slightly frustrating because we try and provide a kind of Bayesian model for flow states, and perhaps Dreyfus would be screaming at me because he'd be saying, "Oh, you can't mathematize it." But really interesting, something that's very interesting about Dreyfus's skill hierarchy. He has this example about about fighter jet pilots, and that when fighter jet pilots instruct novice fighter jet pilots, there's a checklist of an order, so you must check the light. But when they actually, I believe it was eye scanning experiments on fighter jet pilots in the jets, they realized they were not following that order whatsoever. So it's not just that the rules are embedded, encoded, unconsciously followed out. It's almost that they're not followed out, which implies that it's their inexpertise, perhaps. And maybe this is not the case for all expertise, but Dreyfus is quite strong that expert chess players are not following rules.
Yes.
There's almost a relinquishing of rules. And there's actually quite a strict division between those who have to kind of follow this epistemic behavior, this guideline following, and then those who just do
Yep.
in some sense. And again, I don't think Dreyfus comes to the conclusion of exactly how that
No.
works. But it's very interesting to think that this isn't just a absorption act of absorbing rules, but actually might be an absolving of rules. It might be a denial of rules. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's fascinating nonetheless.
Very interesting. I mean, I hope that what goes on a lot of the time is the absorbing of procedures so that you're not even aware you're doing them. But you're suggesting, and I have no reason to doubt it, that at times they're not followed. I mean, it comes back to the observation that you have to really, really know the rules before you're allowed to break them. And I think that is very important because too much of the time we neglect skill in allowing people they want to develop a talent. And what we do is encourage them, just do what you feel like and let it all hang out. And, I know where that comes from, and some of that is good, but actually something very important is also much more important, which is you really do need to learn the procedures. By the time Raphael was 9, he could master all kinds of techniques that most people would be drawing for decades before they'd be able to do so. But he did actually learn them. He wasn't born with them. So there's that. But yes, I mean, when that pilot landed the plane on the Hudson, and when a surgeon suddenly reacts to whatever is going on in theatre, I mean, when asked afterwards, they often say, "Well, I don't know what I did. I just did what I have to." And it is interesting that may actually involve denying certain rules. I mean, obviously there are certain rules. You know why they're there. And in most contexts, they're important. But in a certain particular context, it might be a crucially time-wasting step to follow that rule or procedure. And you need to cut through to something else.
Yes. Well, it speaks to our bureaucratic infrastructures, which I'm sure we can speak about at length. I mean, one thing I will add is that we don't, at least in this paper, we don't deny the presence of anything. We don't just act as if there would be no model if it was just this kind of elusive, mysterious unfolding, this disclosure. I think the really important thing that we try to emphasize was context and the importance of contextual cues. And so we argue that a lot of what's happening in flow states, for example, is this constantly unfolding contextual cueing, which we sort of can understand as a habitual mental action. And Dreyfus talks about this a lot as well, that even if it's not, given this contextual cue, I do this, it puts you in this kind of gestalt condition where you know exactly what to do without knowing that you know, and it's all implicit and it's unfolding. Yeah. And yet, and exactly what you said about the distraction, if a distraction is sufficiently takes you away, if it doesn't act as a contextual cue for these unfolding dynamics, then you're out of the state. And you have to work your way back into it by, in some ways, recovering, quite a loaded philosophical term, these contextual cues. So I think all of this is very much on track, and I think we're finding convergence here. I guess another part of this is intuition, and the role of intuition in skillful coping and expertise. What do you take intuition to be, and how much do you think that it drives our everyday behavior? Because as Dreyfus and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger will tell us, we live intuitively. Right? I know how to sit on this chair. I know how to speak English. I know how to drink water. Is there how can we integrate intuition into this picture?
Yes, well, again, I'd sort of reverse that and say, how do we integrate the rest into the picture of intuition, which is the overarching picture? I mean, if you think about intuition as basically the unconscious processes that we have, we can now put a fairly accurate figure on this, that all that our nervous system and our body in general is aware of is infinitely greater than the amount that we self-consciously are aware of. So the little bit we're self-consciously aware of that you know is the bit that you're looking at with the left hemisphere focal attention. But that is estimated to be slightly over 0.5% out of the 100%. The rest is all being done outside the glare of attention. And, sorry, this is a bit kind of simplistic, I guess, but I hope you'll forgive me. I think people say the unconscious, in a lot of people's minds, it's something like the cellar. It's somewhere down there, as it were, in the dark, that is, a tank below everything that's going on in the sunlight. And occasionally fish pop up from the bottom tank and occasionally the boat go down. But instead, I would use the image of a spotlight on a stage, that where the spotlight is what you're focused on. But it hasn't altered the rest of the stage. All the rest of the possibility is still there. It's just not actually currently in the spotlight. And I think that's a better way to think of it. Now, what intuition is really saying is that, or what it means is to contact that other 95% in whatever way. And it's not inferior. I mean, of course it can be mistaken, but as I repeatedly say, simply following a line of argument can lead to mistakes as well, as in the schizophrenic, for example. So you need context and you need intuition as well as you need the power of logic. And I'm not dissing any element in there. So what I think intuition enables us to do is the complex stuff. So it enables us to make decisions with far-reaching consequences, to balance alternatives, to form an intention to do a certain thing. We don't do these things consciously. They come up through periods when we are not attending. And what they have over the explicit consciousness is that in that explicit consciousness, if I articulate what I'm thinking, we can only have a sentence or serial sentences. But in intuition, there may be 12 or 15 strands that are contributing. And when I try to articulate, I automatically go back to the obvious. I articulate what seems to be salient. But all the things that are not salient, but nonetheless very important, are speaking to me. With the result that I can't remember his name, but there is an academic jurist at one of the Max Planck Institutes in Germany who says, he's the director of it, and he says people who are in charge of large organizations should be telling their people to use their intuitions. And I think he's dead right. I mean, there's an army of psychologists, no disrespect to the profession, who are going around making a lot of money telling people in organizations not to trust their intuitions. But I think this is very, very much a half story, and the worst half of the story, because by not listening to your intuitions, you end up in very strange places. I think there are examples around us of how that is happening. So in the matter of things, I have a whole section of 3 chapters on intuition and the literature on intuition and how it works and whether it works and so on. And once again, it's not an all or nothing thing, but when we overthink things, we usually make them worse, unless things have already broken down. In other words, it's like a toolkit that you get out of the boot when you need to repair. And this is where Whitehead said this wonderful thing, that operations of thought are like cavalry charges in battle. They can only be made at decisive moments. They require fresh horses, and they can't be the main thing you rely on. So this is how it is. We shouldn't be thinking that by overthinking we will make better decisions. We often don't.
Well, I think to add to that, I'm in complete agreement. I think the other slightly ironic thing is this claim that you could ever dispense with intuition. And I think if you try to dispense with it, like this is, I think in many ways it comes to what you were saying about the take that the non-conscious is a kind of discarded cellar that it very rarely sees the light. And I think in some ways we can blame Plato for this and some two worlds mythologizing. But my take on this is that, to use your spotlight example, and as you know, it's a very common example in the attentional literature. It's often taken that this spotlight is it's moving itself. It's like the hand is within the spotlight. My claim is that this spotlight is fundamentally enslaved, again to use this word, by so much that you can never become aware of. So even the very fact of paying attention to a siren, or it is not an arbitrary act to pay attention to a siren, even if it's purely reflectual. Why is it reflective? Well, it's probably because at some point there was some evolutionary pressure to pay attention to things that are loud or luminous and whatnot. And I think there's been a great mistake in dichotomizing these things: exogenous, endogenous, unconscious, conscious, such that we don't realize that they're always in play with one another. They're always in concert. And if you think that your spotlight is solely guiding itself, you're very blind to how biased that spotlight is, and how much it is driven by that which lurks underneath your conscious awareness. So I think again, it points exactly to what you've said in all of your books, which is relationality. That there is no one without the other, and in many ways, a self-guiding spotlight would be totally useless. To what end, apart from the spotlight's own maintenance, would it has to be in some ways constrained and subserving and being a very good emissary. But I worry that the spotlight attention metaphor is itself emblematic of this kind of self-referentiality that the left hemisphere is propagating.
And one of the things I ought to just mention is that people worry that if things happen through unconscious promptings, that somehow they are not deciding. But this is because they've already decided that they are just that little tiny bit of conscious them, as though all their unconsciousness was not also a very important part, the main part of who they are. And it's that's the
right. Yes. Well, again, it's the great irony that even that part of you which is conscious is not blind or encapsulated with respect to the parts that are non-conscious. They're constantly filtering information in and out of one another. So even if you wanted to say, "Oh, I'm just this little morsel," well, you can't be, because it's kind of like Heraclitus' river. It's always in flux. And excellent. Okay, this is all super. I want to very briefly ask about the relationship that we've been speaking about with respect to the hemispheric differences and the underlying cognitive infrastructure to broader social changes, historical changes. So when I was, when I finished the master in his emissary, I like reading book reviews after reading books, because I'm always interested to see whether my thoughts converge with other people's. And I thought there was an extremely slightly shallow one by Owen Flanagan. So this is 15 years ago, so you may not remember. But he said that
he hadn't read
sort
the
of
book. He even gets the
there's part. Well, I think he gets it mixed up. Yes, he gets it mixed up. But he makes the claim that 2,500 years of history are ill understood, as are hemispheric differences, and then as a result, trying to do the mapping between hemispheric differences and historical evolution is a slightly fraught problem. I'm curious about just generally, and it can be brief. What relationship do you establish there between the brain and historical events, whether it's the Greeks, the Romans, the Romantics, and so on?
I can't help reflecting that Flanagan's University Duke just invited me back to give the John P. McGovern lecture. I looked for him in the audience.
Well,
he was hiding. No, there can be a misunderstanding, because, very literal-minded people go, but a brain is something in a human being. It can't be in a society. And, okay, I get that. But what I'm pointing to is not either that changes in the brain have caused changes. I'm not in the business of saying what causes what, and I don't think the brain itself is causative of such changes in society. But what I thought about, it was really inspired by Louis Sass's work, particularly Madness and Modernism, and this extraordinarily brilliant book, I think, in which he looks at the patterns of thinking and creativity and art in the last 100 years or so, and relates it to the phenomena experienced by people with schizophrenia. And obviously, it's not that we've all got schizophrenia. It's that, as he hints in one of his appendixes, Schizophrenia mimics what it's like when you have right hemisphere dysfunction. And so what he's really saying is, at the moment, our society ignores all the kinds of more subtle things that the right hemisphere knows in favor of fatally simplified theoretical understandings of things, and that this is causing problems. So I sort of thought, well, but presumably clearly this hasn't always been the case. So when looking back in history, what do we see? And in a former life, I was effectively interested in the history of ideas, and so I thought, well, let's review Western civilization from the Greeks through the Romans up to the Renaissance and beyond to the Enlightenment and Romanticism and Modernism. And what I think I can see there in three cases is that there's been a change in emphasis over time, in which in each case there is initially a rather sudden and surprising period. It tends to happen rather quickly, in which suddenly there's a move forward of both the right and left hemisphere together, working well, complementing one another, always with the left hemisphere being the, as it were, the functionary that assists the master rather than taking charge. That's when things go astray. But as each civilization has advanced in terms of its wealth, its power, its extent, this has gone hand in hand with an extension of the left hemisphere's control, because the left hemisphere's raison d'etre is, in fact, control, power, utility. And as a result, the subtler things that had sustained the civilization began to wane and the civilization crashed. So what I'm talking about there is not that, I mean, obviously the brain is always evolving, so there will be changes if you were to brain scan a Chian man in the 6th century BC and somebody now, but they'll be very minor and they're not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is how we use our brains. Our brains are there still, and our right hemisphere is telling us things, but we've been somehow indoctrinated. And I'm not suggesting that there's some, cult that's indoctrinating us. I'm just meaning the mindset that we've got in through an industrialized society and a capitalist society is that everything is to do with amassing power and material. It's all about utility, and that everything else is sort of going to hell in a handcart, effectively. But it's not that we lack the insight. So what a lot of people who read my work, either the master or the matter, say to me is, you made me aware of things that I knew at some level, but had no way of articulating or arguing for. But you've given me that.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the great import of your work. It comes back to this idea of revealing that which was already there. So I never so I haven't read the Matter of Things, and I will. But when I read the Master and his Emissary, I didn't. I mean, you're obviously introducing a hemispheric theory. I never felt that you were imposing anything. I never felt it was an imposition on my way of understanding. It was more of as you say, this kind of this unraveling, this unsculpting. The way that Leibniz talks about knowledge is it's just chipping away to leave something that was already there. I mean, I think an interesting revolution that's going on at the moment is both mindfulness and psychedelics. And to be oddly personal, I'm in Mexico currently, and Mexico is particularly replete with psilocybin. And on a psilocybin trip a couple of weeks ago, quite an intense one. And this may in part be because of my reading of your work. It was this remarkable multiplicity and unity, unity and multiplicity. But I wonder whether you thought about this, which is, to what degree will the people who are reading your books, who then go out and see, the universe in a petal, to paraphrase William Blake, to what degree do you worry that this is just a sort of biasing effect of having read your work, and it's not actually a kind of authentic disclosure of the world structure, at least on their part, but rather a sort of, again, a kind of left hemispheric, self-evidencing, self-confirming way of being. Because that was in part my worry over the experience. It was incredibly profound and beautiful, and I was in the middle of the forest, and things felt very much alive and had their own autonomy, and yet were partaking in this kind of broader structure. But after it finished, I thought, well, maybe that's because I've been reading a lot of Iain's work. And so, is there a way of potentially mitigating this potential problem?
Well, I have nothing to say, as you know, about mind-altering substances of this kind. It's interesting, though, that you think there was some cousinhood between whatever it was you were reading and this experience. I like that. I don't know what I think about that. I mean, people often say, aren't these substances sort of releasing the right hemisphere? And I don't think they are. I think what they're doing is they're suppressing frontal cortical function. And the frontal cortex, of course, is the major filter of what it is that we do attend to and experience. And I think that's when that's removed, then there is, as it were, the floodgates are open, and you see a lot of things together, and maybe you get a sense that, yes, they belong together, which is, I think, probably a real feeling that they do. We can't go on leading our lives in that state, whereas I hope that we can go on leading our lives with whatever it is I've given to people, because they do often say things like, you've altered my life. Once you see this, you can't not see it. And I say for the better, they report moving things about the way their lives have changed through reading my work, which is completely unforeseen. I hadn't the slightest idea. I hoped it would be interesting to some people. I had great hopes, but I had no idea that it might actually have this effect on people, which is just totally lovely. Obviously, I don't think that what I'm suggesting is false or far-fetched. I think if it were, probably it wouldn't have the impact that it generally seems to have, even on people who are fairly skeptical to begin with. Because most people, particularly in the world of psychology, I think, there's a sort of catch-22 that when you're told that hemisphere differences are not important, because they don't really mean anything, then of course you don't do the reading to find out whether they are or not. So it's a sort of self-confirming situation. And one of the things I'm battling against is the tendency to fail to report hemisphere differences. I'm hoping that in future, when people do brain research, they will always, even if it's a null finding, just report, are there any hemisphere differences? It's a question that really must be asked. And the more we ask it, the more we will understand what I've tried to understand, no doubt inadequately, but we will understand it better.
Well, I mean, the Master and his Hemisphere, and I'm sure the Matter of Things is obviously replete with references nonetheless, so people can go there. But I agree. I mean, I think in many ways, as a kind of budding psychologist and philosopher, it's as you said, it's a consequence of the frameworks in which we adopt. And so, if we have a particularly popular framework, and let's say something like top-down versus bottom-up differences, then everything is studied or pursued through the lens of hierarchical systems. And as you say, for example, Kahneman and Tversky are very interested in this verticality, and to the detriment of horizontality. And well, I think hopefully you'll start to see the fruits of your labour, because I do think the conversation is around hemispheric differences is changing quite immensely. Talking about grand unifying theories, I asked people on Twitter very briefly a couple of days ago about what they wanted me to ask you.
Okay.
And this is, as I said, it's an Active Inference Insights podcast, although I spend so much of my time talking about consciousness that it ought to be a consciousness podcast. But people wanted to know about what you thought about this kind of grand unifying theory and whether you'd thought about it at all. So have you given Carl's work much reading? Have you spoken to Carl? And have you got any thoughts on the free energy principle or predictive processing or anything aligned?
Well, I fear that I'm slightly like Moliere's cook in this. Molière, when he was trying out his plays, he used to read them to his cook first to find out what the reaction was. And I'm afraid I'm as ignorant as Molière's cook. And I have tried to understand, and I hope I have understood some of what the active inference principle involves and the free energy principle. I'd like to be told, really, what does it add to something that we have always believed, which is that no perception is naive, that we're not just like sort of photographic plates, that we go to the world with predictions, with presumptions about what it is we're likely to see and so on. And that's, of course, very beneficial. It not only saves energy, but it saves time, and it makes us much more effective at living. But what does this really add to that? Because, I mean, yes, we change our behavior in the light of that, and the behavior makes the environment feedback. I mean, really what it seems to me to be saying in a rather more complicated way is what I'm saying is that everything is relational, that what we perceive and take to be reality, some of it comes from us, some of it comes from out there. That doesn't make it unreal, and that the environment, if one must call it that, but the world around us and ourselves are interdependent. We are bringing one another about, so there's a constant dialogue between them. That's the way I see it. And I find that the maths and all that is very impressive, but I'm not sure quite what it is. Perhaps you can tell me what it is it's adding. I want to say, so Carl, what is the question to which the answer is the free energy principle?
Okay, so if I can speak on his behalf, which I can't, but I shall, and I actually think it'll be a wonderful conversation with you and Carl and others. But the idea here is that, well, there's an ongoing debate, is what I'll start with. There's an ongoing debate between the instrumentalist and realist depictions of active inference. So on one hand, you say, okay, we can model the behavior of everything through this Bayesian framework. So everything that persists through time as the thing that it is can be described in terms of Bayesian inference. And what this means is that things embody, encode a model of themselves and the world and their relationship. And they act, or they can be described as acting in order to provide evidence for that model. And this can be taken from this, as I said, the scale. I think this is one of the important things of this is a totally scale-free principle. So you can leverage this to describe the existence of and the persisting existence of anything from an atom to the cosmos. Now, that's the instrumentalist thing, which is it's an extremely useful modeling tool because it talks about how things can be sparsely coupled to one another and thus how they change in relationship to one another. Exactly what you've been talking about, such that if I act on the world and the world acts on me, we enter into this mutually coupled eco-niche agent relationship, which again is not different from the insights of ecological psychology or embodied 4E cognitive science. Now, the complete other end of the spectrum is what's the realist version of active inference, which in many ways takes a predictive processing account, which is that the brain is not just that it can be described as encoding a generative model, it is a generative model. And the way all the brain cognition is, or all forms of brain cognition, are fundamentally predictive. Such that we leverage predictions. We leverage predictions about the world. And when we receive the sense data from the world, which is ultimately always divergent from our predictions, we either update our model of the world or we act to change the world so as to make that sense data more concordant with our generative model. And so in principle, this is a updating of Helmholtzian perception, his notion of perception as inference, but it includes action. And I think that's the great part of it, which is that we in many ways enslave the world by changing it in accordance with our preferences. Now, obviously, the world is also enslaving us, right? Because if a car hits me, doesn't matter what I want from the world, that car has provided evidence for itself as a kind of bulldozing mechanism. But I think what a lot of people are interested from you is, again, like the maths is the maths, and people are trying to understand exactly how this can be implemented computationally. I guess the question for you is, what is the role of a kind of meta theory, or what are the limitations of a meta theory? And as you say, is this just a rewording of something which was implicit in all these other strands of theoretical biology, neuroscience, physics, and so on? Or is it actually saying something new? So I really think ultimately this is just telling me that you should speak to Carl.
Well, I'm sure it would go
But I'm curious about
way
anyway.
over
You know,
my
I've
head.
given you the very.
Molière's cook here. I forget.
I've given you the sort of layman pub
Well,
version of
that's
active
fine. I
inference.
mean, that's
Carl.
maybe what I need. I mean, I still feel that I'm not aware of what it is that it's added to my understanding of how perception and action go on. It hasn't changed the way I think about it, maybe because I haven't understood it, or maybe because I've already intuitively understood it and incorporated it. I don't know. But the thing that it does do, though, for me, is to bring with it a feeling that comes from the sort of overwhelming idea of this meta theory or meta world or meta whatever, that somehow we've mastered this, we can predict it, it's all mechanical. It's produced an image of a world that I don't recognize and I don't really want to know. Whereas I'm more Blake-like. I go out and I see these wondrous living beings and all that, and the beauty of the world and the complexity and the unpredictability of it seems to have been lost in a sea of graphs and sort of, calculus. Not that there's
Yes,
anything wrong with it,
diagrams. Yeah.
but I would want to say, but I think it needs to recognize its own partiality, that it's just a partial
Yes.
approach. So that's what I'd say about the meta
Yes.
thing. And I don't claim, by the way, that,
Well, I guess.
sorry. No, I was just going to say,
No, please,
I
please
don't
continue.
claim that the hemisphere theory is a sort of meta theory, although I believe it has many, many consequences if it's true, and the evidence for those consequences is something that I'm, looking for both in the scientific literature and in the social psychological literature. Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing to add to this is that active inference, or the free energy principle, cannot. Well, some people might think it can, but it can't solve
No,
consciousness, and
I'm not
so we're still left with this massive
surprised.
conundrum. But I guess to finish up, to return to the hemispheric differences, you finish the master and his emissary with this very provocative but also quite alluring and endearing line, which is that if it all turns out to be a metaphor, then that's fine because you have high regard for metaphors, which I liked a lot. And metaphors really underpin for me they underpinned the tenor, the thrust of that whole book. And again, holding this tension that metaphors allow us to understand the world, but also, in many ways, if it is just a metaphorical theory, we still need to pay respect to that and also return back to the phenomena.
Yes.
What, just in terms of the hemispheric differences, I was slightly confused by what it actually meant for that to be a metaphor. What would it mean for the hemispheric theory to be a metaphor?
Well, what it wouldn't necessarily mean is that there's anything wrong with the science. Science is based on metaphors. The important point is that you cannot understand anything without a metaphor, and that the use of metaphor in science and philosophy is particularly important and heavy. So you cannot step outside metaphors if you wish to understand something. It's very obvious in physics, and it's been argued for by various philosophers. So I think that's what I meant there. It was a slightly sly one in which I was giving a little obeisance at the end and saying, well, maybe I got it wrong. But nonetheless, actually, you can only understand things through metaphors. And I've given you a pretty important metaphor. But rather literal-minded people have gone, oh, well, Oh, so he thinks it's only a metaphor, like
Mm,
only a metaphor, meaning there isn't any literal truth to it.
right.
But there is literal truth to it. I mean, I'll stake a lot on that. And I've taken, I hope you will, well, what you do with your time is up to you. And it's a terrific ask to read this book, The Matter with Things. But I think
Oh, I'm going to.
after
I'm
this
going to. I'm certainly
conversation, I'm
shall.
certain you will enjoy it. But in it, I take the discussion to greater levels of depth. And you think I've put a lot of evidence into the Master and his Hemisphere, and the bibliography there looks like a postscript. Um,
A whole book.
the bibliography here is 180 pages because I really needed to look at a lot of stuff, and I really did look them up and inspect them because a lot of the time it's amazing working in the area is that you look up something that's been quoted and requoted and quoted as saying X, and you look them up, and actually it
Mm,
says not X. It doesn't even say why. It,
mm,
it says
mm.
not X. So there are one or two
Yeah, yeah,
occasions
yeah.
in which that has happened. But yeah, so I do care. I care about empirical evidence. I think it's incredibly important. And if we lose that, what have we got? To I don't say empirical evidence is everything. Of course, it has to be taken up into an understanding and so forth. But if we actually throw away the importance of empirical evidence, we're cast free. We have no lodestone to guide us. And one of the sinister things that's happening now, you wanted to talk about what's happening now very briefly, but I mean, one of the things that worries me very badly is the well known fact that science is now being heavily skewed by political pressures to conform to a
Mm.
certain narrative about the way things are. And that perfectly good science that suggests that it's more complicated than that is not being recognized. And when Nature actually writes an editorial saying it's not going to publish things just because they're good science, they have to be on message. Well, that's the end of science as far as I'm concerned.
Do you, with that in mind, do you hold, people talk about the pendulum, the political
Yeah,
pendulum swinging, and I guess in this case it's the scientific pendulum swinging. Do you think nature, and I mean nature, both in its literal sense of nature and nature as in the journal, will nature bite back at nature? Will this come home to roost? Because I think there is this utopian. I guess there's this utopian idea that if we can self censor, if we
yes,
can confirm the theories that we already have in mind without questioning the underlying axioms of those
yeah,
theories, then everything will just be
yeah.
dandy. Do you think that reality itself always comes home to roost and will bite
Well, I
back?
do, if we give it long enough to do so without destroying ourselves. I mean, in the longer run, reality will come
Yes.
back, of course. And utopianism has been the cause of the most cruel, despotic, totalitarian projects in human history. So, no, we must resist that at all costs. And I suppose what is beginning to happen is that people are starting up universities, private universities, where people can really learn and study without being forced into a straitjacket about what they say. And journals will spring up that will
Mm.
publish things and so on. And no doubt Twitter will ban them or something. But we've got to get beyond this kind of mind that we ban things if we don't like them. The answer is not that. The answer is
Yes.
to be able to look at what is said in a reasonable, rational, temperate manner and discuss it. Because if we could do that, there is nothing that cannot be resolved. Discussion is better than fighting. I profoundly believe.
Well, indeed. I think, again, this is, I think, a Nietzschean or Dostoevskian idea that you can't get rid of things by pushing them underground. In many ways, you just make them
Of
more
course,
Um,
yes. And
yeah.
in a curious
Well,
inverse way, I
that's a,
saw that with
yes.
religion in the Soviet Union. Um, I mean, although
Mm,
I suppose I'd have to call myself of a religious cast of mind, I've always had a kind of love hate relationship with the church. But when I was in Russia in the Soviet years in the 70s, I remember going to the cathedrals in what was then Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and seeing how they thrived. Middle of Wednesday morning on a weekday, the
Mm,
cathedral was packed with people praying, lighting candles, singing together, and so on. And I thought, this is so bloody moving, because also as they came out, there were
yeah,
these leather jacketed, sunglassed thugs photographing them all so that they could make sure that their children would never go to university. So it took courage. And when you repress it,
golly.
it thrives. Now that it's no longer repressed, I don't know. I've heard that congregations are falling off. Maybe wrong.
Well, there does be a return to I don't like the word spiritual, but
Yeah,
a spiritually minded way of being, right? I mean, in many ways, one has to give credit here to someone like Jordan Peterson. And I know you've spoken to John Vervaeke. I think you and John share quite similar perspectives here with a skepticism on organized religion, but also recognizing the loss that a fundamental contact with reality
absolutely.
yields. And being 25 years old and having grown up in metropolitan London my whole life, I can tell you that the urge in me is to be extremely cynical and condescending towards those of a religious mentality, because it's always been the way I was
Mm,
raised,
mm.
But I think there's a
I
counter
think there is
evolution,
too.
and whether this and I guess the interesting point is the metaphysical grounding of this is somewhat, well, it's not arbitrary, but it's not as important as the fact that church
Mm.
or these centres are points of communion,
I know, I know.
and I think we dispense with that at our peril. I mean, I found, for example, that actually team sport is the most unbelievable form of
Right?
healing in
Yeah,
some ways. Just to be in concert with people, to be trusting people, to
yes,
be in flow
yes.
with people,
I can
and
believe it.
yes, I think this actually all points to your work that, as you say, relations precede relata. That we
Yeah,
are kind of nothing without
yes. Well,
relationships.
there's
Ian,
a
this has just been an absolute joy. I am so very grateful to you. I'm very grateful to Mexican Wi-Fi for having only messed up
yeah,
once.
okay.
Um, I'm on the border of Mexico and Belize, and I have a boat to take to Belize of all places. So the Wi-Fi there, I think, will be particularly spotty.
Well,
So I'm very grateful for your
well,
time. I always like to ask people to just say where people can find them, find their work. I mean, obviously, you have these two enormous and epic and wonderful tomes, but beyond that, where can people find what you're working on currently? I mean, what are you working on currently?
well, you won't find that anywhere actually, because I'm not really sure. I've got a number of things that are bubbling away. I may not have time to finish any of them, but basically, the place to go is Channel McGilchrist. If you just put Channel McGilchrist into the Google bar, it'll take you there. Some people think it's an imperative, but it's just a description. And there's YouTube. You can always just Google my name on YouTube, and I'm afraid there's an appalling number of interviews on there. My friends complain that they can't go anywhere
Well, I
without
think you
bumping
are.
into me.
I'd like to say. I think no, you're one of the great podcast
Okay,
guests,
thank you.
and I don't.
I'm,
I genuinely do
oh,
mean
I'm glad.
this. Some of the podcasts, no, well, some of them that you've done are just wonderful. I particularly liked your first one with Kurt
Oh,
Jaimungal,
yes.
where you're sort of guiding him
So
through
did
his
I.
slightly,
Yeah.
yeah, it was incredibly
And now
intense.
he's read The Matter with
But
Things,
it
and
was
we're planning to do another, so that's good. But he wanted to make sure he'd read it properly.
well, good.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, he's also got some overlap with the active inference community, actually, because he's interviewed Carl a number of
Right.
times, and
Yeah.
I think he hosts some roundtables. So the worlds do collide and
There we are.
converge. But
Wonderful.
I'm going to read the matter of
Okay.
things.
Good luck.
I'm going to make that a project of mine.
Okay. Very good.
Let's see how long it takes.
No hurry. Okay. Thanks.
But again,
Thanks very much,
thank you
Darius.
so honestly, thank you so very
Enjoy
much.
being in Mexico. It's a lot warmer than it is here on Sky, I imagine, but Good luck. Yeah.
I've heard it's rather chilly on the British Isles, so I'm
I'm
quite happy
afraid
to
it
be here
is.
despite
Yes,
their
yes.
electrical issues.
All right. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. All right, Ian. Thank you so much. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.